I froze the moment the zipper gave way. My hands were soaking wet. My knees were pressed into the muddy bank of the river, and the torch I'd propped against a rock was casting long shadows across the water. I'd been standing there for nearly 10 minutes before I finally found the courage to pull that bag out. And when I did, when I finally saw what was inside, I wished, just for a moment, that I hadn't followed my son-in-law that night. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, because none of this will make sense without it. My name is Graham. I'm 64 years old, retired, and I've lived in the same house in Ballarat, Victoria, for the better part of 30 years. My wife, Denise, passed away from breast cancer 6 years ago, and since then it's just been me, my vegetable garden, my 2 border collies, and the weekly dinners I share with my daughter, Claire, and her husband, Darren. Those Friday night dinners were the highlight of my week. Claire would make a roast. I'd bring a bottle of red, and Darren would sit at the head of the table making everyone laugh. He was good at that, making people laugh, making people feel at ease. I used to think it was one of his best qualities. I should tell you a bit about Darren, because you need to understand who I thought he was before I can explain what I discovered. He was 37 when all this started. Claire was 35. They'd been married for 8 years. And from the outside, they looked like the kind of couple you'd be envious of. He worked in logistics for a warehouse company just outside of town, drove a decent ute, kept the lawn mowed, remembered birthdays. Claire seemed happy. That was all I'd ever wanted for her, especially after losing her mother. If Claire was happy, I could sleep at night. The first time I noticed something off was a Thursday evening in late autumn. I'd driven over to drop off some zucchini from the garden I always grew more than I could eat. And when I pulled into their driveway, Darren's ute was gone. Claire was in the kitchen, and she seemed perfectly relaxed. So I didn't think much of it. I asked where he was, and she said, very casually, that he'd gone down to the river. Said he'd started going most evenings after work. Said it helped him unwind. What river? I asked. The Yarrowee, she said. Just the stretch near the old park. He takes his fishing gear. I nodded, accepted a cup of tea, stayed for an hour, and drove home. Nothing alarming. Men fish. Men need to decompress after work. I understood that. But a few weeks later, I was there again for dinner, and Claire mentioned in passing that Darren had already gone to the river before I arrived, that he'd be back by 9. I glanced at the clock. It was 6:30. That was a long time to fish a stretch of urban river after a full work day. I didn't say anything. I helped Claire with the dishes, watched a bit of telly, and waited. Darren came home at 9:10, smelling of river water and cold air, carrying his tackle box and his rod bag. He was cheerful, kissed Claire on the cheek, shook my hand. Normal as anything. I went home that night and told myself I was being paranoid. Retired men with too much time on their hands start seeing problems where there aren't any. I knew that about myself. I'd been guilty of it before, but the thought kept nagging at me. Not loudly, just quietly, like a tap that isn't quite turned off. Over the following month, I started paying closer attention. Not in a dramatic way. I wasn't driving past their house at night or anything like that. I just listened more carefully when Claire talked about Darren's evenings. And what I noticed was that it wasn't just occasionally. It was almost every night, Monday through Friday, and sometimes Saturday. Rain or shine, cold or not, he was going to that river. One Friday when I came for dinner, I asked Darren directly how the fishing had been. He smiled, leaned back in his chair, and launched into a perfectly convincing story about a big redfin he'd nearly landed the previous Wednesday, the one that got away, the way the line had gone taut and then slack in half a second. He was animated, detailed, completely relaxed. Later, when Claire was in the bathroom, I walked past the laundry where Darren's fishing gear was stored on a shelf. I stopped. I'm not sure why instinct, maybe, or just old-fashioned nosiness. I looked at the tackle box sitting on the shelf. The latches weren't even fully closed. I lifted the lid. It was spotless. The lures were arranged neatly, nothing tangled, no dried worm or bait smell, no river mud caked into the corners. I've fished my whole life. I know what a tackle box looks like when it's being used regularly. This one looked like it had been sitting in a shop window. I closed it carefully, walked back to the kitchen, and smiled when Darren came in and asked if I wanted another glass of wine. "I'm right, thanks," I said. Early morning tomorrow. That night I sat in my lounge room for a long time with the television off. Something was wrong. I didn't know what it was yet, but I knew with the particular certainty that comes from 64 years of living that something was wrong. I want to be honest with you about what I was afraid of. My first thought was another woman. That's the obvious conclusion, isn't it? A man who disappears every evening, tells a convincing story, whose equipment shows no sign of actual use. I didn't want it to be that. Not for my sake, for Claire's. She'd already lost her mother. The idea of her discovering a betrayal like that made something harden in my chest. But I also knew that jumping to conclusions was dangerous. I needed to know, not assume. No. So on a Tuesday evening in early July, I did something I'm not proud of, but I'm not ashamed of either. I drove to the street that runs parallel to the Yarrowee corridor near the old park, parked well away from the path, and I waited. I wore a dark jacket, took a small torch, and I sat in the driver's seat with the window cracked, watching the entrance to the riverside walking track. At 7:10, Darren's ute rolled past. He parked about 50 meters ahead of me. I watched him get out, open the back of the ute, and pull out, yes, the rod bag and the tackle box, and a large black duffel bag I'd never seen before. That bag. That was the thing. It was big. The kind of bag you'd use to move house, the kind with thick handles and a wide zipper across the top. He carried it with both hands. And even from 50 meters away, I could tell it was heavy. He adjusted his grip twice before he reached the track entrance. I got out of the car and followed at a distance. The walking track along that stretch of the Yarrowee is pleasant in daylight. Local council keeps it tidy. There are park benches. Families walk dogs there on weekends. At night in July, it was deserted. The path follows the river for about 600 meters before it curves away toward a residential street. I stayed well back, using the tree line as cover, watching the bobbing light of Darren's torch ahead of me. He walked for about 4 minutes, then stopped at a section of the bank where a large willow leans out over the water. I'd walked that path 100 times. I knew the spot. He set the rod bag down and then the tackle box. And then he stood for a long moment, perfectly still, looking up and down the river. I stopped breathing. He picked up the duffel bag again, moved to the edge of the bank, and swung it out over the water. It hit the surface with a heavy splash and sank immediately. I stood there in the dark, 15 meters behind him, and I felt the cold settle into my bones in a way that had nothing to do with the winter air. Whatever was in that bag, he just put it in the river. And the weight of it, that deliberate, purposeful weight, told me this wasn't an accident and it wasn't the first time. Then I heard it. From the water, faint but unmistakable. A sound. High-pitched. Urgent. Something alive. Every instinct in my body fired at once. Darren was already setting up his rod, his back to the water, like a man who had just done something completely routine. I didn't think. I stepped out from the tree line, walked straight to the bank, and went in to my knees. The water was shockingly cold. My boots filled immediately. I swept my torch across the surface, then angled it downward, and in the shallow murk near the bank, I saw it, a dark shape, settled on the silty bottom in less than a meter of water, the zipper faintly visible. I grabbed the handles and pulled it up. Darren turned around. For a moment we just looked at each other. Me standing in the river, soaked to the knees, holding a dripping black bag that was making a sound he'd thought would be silenced by now. Him standing on the bank with a fishing rod in his hand and an expression on his face that I had never seen before and never want to see again. "Graham," he said. His voice was completely flat. I didn't answer him. I hauled the bag onto the bank, crouched down, and pulled the zipper open. A dog. A small terrier, elderly, shaking violently, soaked through. Alive. Barely, but alive. She looked up at me with enormous dark eyes and made that sound again, that thin, desperate sound that I had heard from the water, and I felt something break open inside me that I've never quite been able to close back up since. I looked up at Darren. "That's not ours," he said immediately. "I found it." "You found a dog in a sealed bag," I said. "I was going to come back and—" "Don't," I said. "Don't do that." I took off my jacket, wrapped the dog in it, and held her against my chest. She was trembling so hard I could feel it through my ribs. I stood up and looked at my son-in-law, this man I'd sat across a dinner table from for 8 years, this man who'd held my daughter's hand at her mother's funeral, and I tried to find something in his face that would help me understand what I was looking at. There was nothing. He was already composing himself. I could see it happening in real time. The calculation, the recovery, the shift into damage control. "Graham, listen, how many times?" I asked. He didn't answer. "How many times have you done this?" Still nothing. I walked past him, back up the track, carrying that little dog against my chest, and I didn't look back. I drove straight to the emergency vet on Sturt Street. The vet, a young woman who looked like she'd been in the middle of paperwork, examined the dog thoroughly and told me she was dehydrated, hypothermic, and had older bruising consistent with being handled roughly, but that she would likely make a full recovery with warmth and fluids. She asked me where I'd found her. I told her the truth. She looked at me steadily. "You need to report this," she said. "I know," I said. The dog had a microchip. The vet scanned it and found a registration to a woman named Patricia, 68 years old, an address in a suburb on the other side of Ballarat. Patricia, it turned out, had reported her dog missing. Her name was Rosie, 11 days earlier. She'd put up flyers in her street. She'd called the council. She'd thought Rosie had wandered off and been hit by a car. I stayed at the clinic until Rosie was stable. Then I drove home and sat at my kitchen table until 4 in the morning. I want to tell you what those hours felt like, because I think it matters. I wasn't angry exactly. I was something worse than angry. I was grieving. Not for Rosie. She was going to be all right. I was grieving for the version of Darren I'd believed in. For the 8 years of Friday dinners. For every time I'd looked at him laughing at the head of that table and thought, my daughter is safe. I was grieving for Claire, who had no idea what her husband was, who was asleep at that very moment in the house they shared, 2 kilometers away. And I was thinking about the bag, about how heavy it had been, about how practiced he'd looked. In the morning I called the police. I gave them a full statement. I told them exactly what I'd seen, exactly what I'd found. The officer who took my statement, a sergeant who'd been on the job for 30 years and had the face to show for it, listened without interrupting, wrote everything down, and told me investigators would follow up. Under Victoria's Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, what Darren had done was a serious offense. Deliberate drowning of a domestic animal carries significant penalties, including imprisonment. They would need to gather evidence. But my witness account and the dog's condition were strong starting points. Then I drove to Claire's house. She was in the kitchen when I arrived, in her dressing gown, making toast. She took one look at my face and put the toast down. "Dad, what's happened?" I sat down at the table, the same table I'd eaten 100 dinners at, and I told her everything. Not the softened version, the full version. I owed her that. She didn't cry immediately. She listened with her hands flat on the table, very still. The way she used to sit as a child, when she was trying to be brave about something. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "The tackle box," she finally said. "Pardon?" "I noticed the tackle box was always clean," she said. I thought I was imagining it. She hadn't been imagining it. She'd known something, somewhere, without letting herself fully know it. I understood that. Sometimes we protect ourselves from the truth until someone sits across from us and makes it impossible to look away. Darren was not at home when the police attended later that day. He'd taken his ute and gone. He'd apparently understood, during those hours, between my walking away from him on the riverbank and the moment investigators arrived, that the situation had moved beyond his ability to manage. He went to stay with his brother in Geelong. His solicitor made contact with police within 48 hours. The investigation took 4 months. During that time, police spoke to neighbors, reviewed Darren's movements, and identified 3 other animals reported missing in the area over the preceding 18 months, 2 dogs and a cat, whose disappearances had never been explained. They were not able to definitively link Darren to all of them, but the pattern was noted. He was charged with 1 count of cruelty, causing injury under the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, and 1 count of ill treatment. He pleaded guilty. He was fined, received a community corrections order, and was banned from owning or keeping animals for 10 years. I will be honest with you. I wanted more. I think any decent person would have wanted more. But the guilty plea spared Claire from giving evidence. And I understand that the legal system moves according to its own logic, not according to what feels proportionate to a father standing on a riverbank in the dark. Claire filed for divorce 4 weeks after his guilty plea. She handled it with a quiet dignity that reminded me so much of her mother. I had to look away sometimes. She moved into a smaller place in the same suburb, closer to me. She brought Rosie home. Yes. Patricia, whose dog Rosie was, heard the full story through the local paper. There was a brief report when Darren was sentenced, and she called the vet clinic, who passed her details on to me. We spoke on the phone for over an hour. She wept when I told her about finding Rosie in the water. She said she'd been devastated for weeks, convinced Rosie had suffered somewhere alone. I told her that Rosie had survived and was recovering, and I heard something release in her voice that I won't forget. She offered Rosie to Claire. She was elderly, her own health was uncertain, and she thought Rosie deserved a younger home. Claire drove over to meet her the following Sunday, and they talked for 3 hours. Claire came home with Rosie tucked under her arm and a light in her eyes I hadn't seen in a long time. Rosie is 4 kilograms of fury and stubbornness, and she sleeps on Claire's bed and barks at the postman with an energy that seems completely disproportionate to her size. She is, without question, the best thing in my daughter's house right now. I still go to the Yarrowie sometimes, on clear mornings. I walk the same track I walked that night. I stop at the willow tree and watch the water moving past. And I think about all the things that might have happened differently. If I'd looked away, if I'd told myself it wasn't my place, if I'd convinced myself I was just a paranoid old man with too much time and too many worries, I didn't look away. That's the only thing I'm certain of. I've had a lot of time to think about why Darren did what he did. I'm not a psychologist, and I won't pretend to understand the interior of a mind that can do that to a living creature. What I do know is that cruelty rarely arrives fully formed. It builds. It finds outlets that are small enough to go unnoticed, hidden behind reasonable explanations and ordinary routines. A man who goes fishing every evening. A tackle box that never gets dirty. A large bag that nobody asks about. The signs were there. They are almost always there. We just have to be willing to look. If you are a parent reading this, or a sibling, or a friend, trust what you notice. Not paranoia, not catastrophizing, but the quiet, persistent sense that something doesn't add up. You are not being intrusive by paying attention to the people you love. You are being responsible. If you see or suspect animal cruelty in Victoria, you can report it to the RSPCA Australia on 1,300 Animal or to your local police. Under Australian law, animals are sentient beings deserving of protection, and there are real consequences for those who harm them. Don't assume someone else will make the call. Make it yourself. And if the person who is causing harm is someone you are close to, someone you've shared meals with, trusted, loved by extension, I know how impossibly hard it is to step forward. I know the weight of it. But I also know what it felt like to carry that small, shaking animal out of freezing water and feel her breathing against my chest. Some things are worth the cost of knowing. Claire is doing well. She started a pottery class last year. Makes these beautiful rough-edged bowls that she gives away as gifts. She came to my place last Friday for dinner roast lamb. A good bottle of red from the Grampians. And we sat at the table long after the plates were cleared, talking about her mother, about her plans, about nothing in particular. Rosie slept in a ball near the heater and occasionally opened one eye to check we were still there. That is what I was protecting all along. That table, that light, that ordinary, irreplaceable evening. It was worth following him,